Hi there, my name's Paulie and welcome to this video. In this video we're going to compare cheap crappy cables to reasonable quality cables. On the left here we have a cheap crappy cable that I bought quite some time ago that really is hardly being used. And on this side we've got something that I've bought in the last few years to compare it to. Now this isn't an overly expensive cable, it's not like a mainstream brand or anything like that. It doesn't have anything fancy written on it, no logos or anything like that, but I consider this to be a reasonably good quality cable. Now what are the differences between cheap crappy cables and decent quality cables? Well, the first thing you want to look out for is these moulded connectors. These basically cannot be repaired, and generally what happens to a cable is every time it moves, generally they move more around this area just outside of the connector, and that's where the conductors will actually snap off inside the insulation. Now you can repair them if you're on the on the tight side of things and don't have a lot of money and you've got a soldering iron. You can cut the cable off 4 inches or 100 millimeters from the connector and start again, reconnect it up and away you go. I've got cables that I've been doing that for probably 20 years and they've still got nothing wrong with them other than every once in a while they go a bit bung and need to be repaired. This is an example of that. This one is a right angled connector, but the principle is exactly the same as the straight. You can unscrew the connector and get to the inside of it. You can strip this little piece of insulation off, cut the cable back, strip it back and reconnect it using a soldering iron and reuse the cable. Can get you out of a spot also. If it happens on a Saturday afternoon when none of the music shops are open, you can repair your cable and move on, just in case you didn't have a spare. So let's look at the next big difference between cheap and nasty cables and reasonable quality cables. The next big difference is noise. Cheap cables pick up heaps of noise. They pick up that 50 or 60 cycle hum. If there's a radio station like an AM radio station nearby, they'll pick that up too. They pick up all sorts of crappy staticky noise from the surroundings. So right now I've got a high gain amp plugged into this AB loop switcher, and on one side we've got our good quality cable, on the other side we've got our cheap and nasty cable. And right now I'm on the good quality cable side, and as you can hear there's just a little hiss. If I hit this switch we can hear this cable. I hope you can hear that. The next big difference between a cheap cable and a reasonable quality instrument cable is the susceptibility of the cable to microphonics and static during movement. Now if you have a cable like this connected between your amplifier and your guitar, or your guitar and your pedal board, and you're running a fair bit of gain, you're going to get some noise, some static and stuff every time you move that cable. So if you like to move around on stage and you're running a cable like this, it's going to sound pretty hideous. So here's an example of that. Right now we're on the good quality cable side, and you can hear just a little bit of noise, and it could be just the static that my hand is creating between the rubber insulation and my fingers. We turn over to this one. Extremely noisy. hardly any noise. That's the next big difference. And that static you heard as I was shaking this cable around, that's due to the conductors inside actually rubbing together, because the insulation is not stabilizing the copper conductors inside the cable, and they rub together and they're touching and then they're not touching and all sorts of stuff like that, and that's what that static is. So good quality cables, the insulation is set on there hot enough so that it actually stabilizes the wiring, the conductors inside the cable. So let's have a look at the next big difference between these cables. The first thing we can see is the thickness of the insulation. This cable is well protected by a really thick insulation. I don't know whether you can see that. And this other guy it's a lot thinner. So I'll strip back these cables and we'll check it out from there. So here's the last big difference between cheap, crappy instrument cables and reasonable quality instrument cables. This is the cheap, crappy cable, and there you can see the center conductor, and you can also see the shield, and I've wound the shield up so it's all together. You'll also notice that the shield's corroded because air has gotten in there and began to corrode the copper over the last 10 years or so that I've had that cable. Now here's the reasonable quality cable, and as you can see, everything is thicker. The center conductor is way thicker. The dielectric, which is the insulation between the center conductor and the shield, is also thicker, which reduces capacitance, which reduces the high-end roll-off that you get with long cable runs. And also the shield is a lot thicker. Now, just by those things alone, this cable, this reasonable quality cable, will last a hell of a lot longer than this cheap, crappy cable with its piddly little conductors. Now, typically I've ran a few of these over the time just to see what would happen, and normally they only last a few years and then they're dead. Whereas these guys, these bigger cables, will last 10 to 15 years without any dramas at all. So there's one more thing I'd like to add about the differences between cheap and nasty cables and reasonable quality cables. And that is that generally reasonable quality cables have some sort of a relief system built into them or added to them to help the cable not fatigue so much where it comes out of the connector. This is to prevent that continual bending and flexing around this area and make the cable last a bit longer. Cheap and nasty cables don't tend to have that much of a relief, and as such they tend to break off a lot quicker. Also, I just want to say that you don't need to spend a fortune on cables. You just need reasonable, decent quality cables with the features that I've just mentioned. There's not a lot of difference between a cable that's worth $20 or $30 and a cable that's worth $100. The features are very similar, the performance is going to be very similar, and what you're talking about in a lot of situations may only be a tiny amount of advantage for all that additional cost. So I hope you found this video interesting and informative, and I hope you've got some decent information out of it. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, and I do videos along this kind of line, you know, electric guitar orientated stuff all the time. I've got a channel pretty much dedicated to it, and don't hesitate to hit that subscribe button. Anyway, have a great day. I'm Paulie, and I'll catch you later.